Hello, everybody. I don't know if we have everybody in yet. How are we doing? Okay. All right, well, I will kick us off. On behalf of the board and the Leadership Council of Tipping Point, I want to thank you all for being here. My name is Daniel Lurie. I'm the CEO of Tipping Point. Thank you. Before we get started, I want to take a moment and acknowledge what we're all going through across California. We're all experiencing these fires in one way or another, and our hearts go out to those that have lost homes, those who have lost loved ones, and all of the firefighters and first responders who are working tirelessly on behalf of our neighbors. We went through this last year, and we're unfortunately going through it together again as a community, and I wanted to acknowledge that, and I wanted to thank you all for making it out tonight. Tipping Point believes that when a person connects with the right programs at the right time, we can break the cycle of poverty. We believe this because we see it every day. Tipping Point identifies and invests in the best interventions in education, employment, housing, and early childhood. We support direct service organizations and also advocate for more effective public systems and policies. We don't have all the answers, and we know that no one does, but since our inception, we have held firm to the bold assertion that poverty is indeed preventable. And there is no manifestation of poverty more visible, more heartbreaking, and more urgent than homelessness. That's why 18 months ago, Tipping Point committed to raising $100 million to reduce the number of chronically homeless individuals in San Francisco by half by 2022. And our strategy is simple. We need to create more housing. We need to slow the inflow of people falling into homelessness. And we need to support government in maximizing their impact. Tonight, you're going to hear from exceptional leaders who bring passion, courage, innovation, and I would argue, most importantly, grit to tackling this crisis. It's the combination of leaders like these and all of you that gives me confidence that if we are smart, if we are focused, we can create a Bay Area where everyone has a place to call home. A few weeks ago, my colleague, Andrea Evans, invited me to a meeting with Del Seymour, founder of Code Tenderloin. Andrea calls herself the president of your fan club. And after spending just a few minutes with Del a few weeks ago, I knew why. And I also knew that we would be crazy not to ask him to kick us off this evening. And he graciously agreed. Del's organization, Code Tenderloin, educates and trains homeless individuals to work in high-paying jobs in the tech industry. He is a board member of Swords to Plowshares and co-chairs San Francisco's local homeless coordinating board. Please welcome the mayor of the Tenderloin, Del Seymour.
Thank you. Good evening, folks. Tipping Point gave me 4 minutes to speak, but I'm 72 years old. It took me 4 minutes to get up here. So I think I'm about out of time. You know, when I first walked in this room about an hour ago, it was empty, and they flashed that question up, can we solve homelessness? My inside said, hell no, we haven't done it yet. And then I walk in here and I see 350 people who have better things to do tonight than come here on a cold, smoky night with no parking around, and you all are here. Now I got to say, hell yes, we can. We won't do it tonight. It took me 18 long years to cure my homelessness. So it's not something you can do overnight. But at least maybe when we leave here tonight, we will be on the road to another way. We got to think out the box tonight. We got to get creative tonight. We got to get mad tonight. We got to argue tonight. We got to disagree tonight. Because I'm tired of going to these panels where everyone is agreeing with each other. And we get nowhere. So tonight, let's get some heat up. Let's get some dialogue. Let's disagree. Let's come up with something new. Because what we're doing is not necessarily working. It's cold outside tonight. It's smoky outside tonight. We just added 20,000 homeless people to our rolls in Northern California in the last week. They'll be here in the next few days. We can't handle the ones we got. We got to get better. We got to get better. So as Daniel humbly said, I started the organization called Tenderloin. Started working out in back of my car. And I've done this with my co-founder, Neil Shaw's here tonight. So we figured out the way that our idea is to manage homeless better is to give people a damn paycheck. The only difference between you and Tyrone laying on 6th Street, you have a paycheck and he don't. No big deal. Let's start getting our people prepared to be able to go out and accept an opportunity, a housing opportunity, by being able to keep that housing opportunity. And comes a simple thing as a paycheck. Since we started, we have put 382 people to work out of our shelters and our tents and our navigation centers. That they won't be homeless again. So one of our missions tonight will be to make sure you understand who a homeless person is. So let me bust a myth for you right now. There is no planet called homelessness where a rocket ship landed here years ago and exploded and everyone jumped off and now we got homeless. These are your cousins, man. These are your brothers. These are your nephews. These are your grandparents. There are grandparents out there in those tents. You know who the homeless are? Remember when you lived in Noy Valley, you had a child care worker named Julie? She was on Valencia late one night, had a couple too many lattes or beers or whatever, got a DUI, lost her child care license. Now she's on division tonight. You know her. Remember Tyrone at the gym? You used to walk around and collect your towels after your workout. High blood pressure, man. Couldn't work anymore. He's living in this car over on Fell Street. Yep, you know Tyrone. You all know Sergeant Marvin. Iraq veteran, proud soldier, PTSD, was in too many incidents, came home. Being a proud Marine, he refused to be labeled as a nut, as a PTSD victim. Never went and got his services. He refused to go and have that label on him. Living in a tent, another tent on 4th Street. You know him. You know Bernard, taught you in high school, was your science teacher at Mission High School. Had a bad divorce. Well, he walked away, didn't want nothing. Proud man. Now he's living in our navigation on 16th Street. Understand who the homeless are. They're not Bobby with a needle in his arm, not necessarily. These are your folks. Didn't come from Planet Homelessness. So I'm going to challenge you to do one thing tonight for me. Everybody in this room has someone homeless in their family. Shake your head. I see you already. Yes, you do. Some of you have too. If you don't believe me, go ask your mom, your dad, your grandparents. Auntie Betty out in Phoenix, you know what I'm talking about. Your nephew in Kansas City, you know who I'm talking about. If your last name is Stevens, you should not allow another Stevens to be living in the tent. You got an extra room at home, and you know you do. You just put stuff in it. Put your cousin in it. If everyone in this room went and got their homeless relative, we would have 312 less homeless tonight. I challenge you to do that. Now, when you go and get those homeless relatives and bring them to your house, I need to put a disclaimer because I don't want you coming back to me, hide your iPad, change your passwords because I can't be responsible, but give them a chance. Give them a chance. If they fail you 6 times, pick them back up 7 times. Do the arithmetic because someone picked you up. You were not able to take that real nice Uber or Lyft and come here and sit here and pay our admissions without someone helping you. Help someone. We can do it right here in this room, folks. I'm going to turn it back over to the panel. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for coming tonight. Okay. Thank you. Okay.
I'm going to challenge Andrea for president of your fan club going forward. Thank you for sharing your story with us, Dale. So here's the game plan for tonight. We've asked these 4 speakers to talk about the work they're doing, and I will then lead a conversation. But I'm going to ask them each to come up and speak for a few minutes, and then we'll get into panel conversation. And so I'm going to introduce everybody up front. First up is Brian Blalock, Tipping Point's Director of Law and Policy, playing a lead role on our $100 million chronic homelessness initiative. Brian has focused his career on supporting vulnerable and disconnected youth in the Bay Area, including starting and running legal clinics for youth experiencing homelessness in 7 counties, and has worked on a number of statewide legislative efforts, including SB 918 on youth homelessness, authored by State Senator Scott Wiener. Next, Dr. Margot Kushel. Through decades of experience at UCSF and Zuckerberg San Francisco General, Margot has seen how homelessness impacts a person's health and well-being. As the director of the UCSF Center for Vulnerable Populations, Margot's work has informed interventions to prevent and end homelessness and to decrease the negative health impacts of homelessness. After Margot, you'll hear from Amber Twitchell. Amber is the Associate Director of On the Move and specializes in the development of youth-led programs that importantly incorporate lived experience into impactful solutions. From Voices, which is a youth-developed community center, to the Spark Initiative, a team of peer mentors who connect homeless youth to services, there isn't a leader out there that's better at creating programs by and for vulnerable young people. And Tomiquia Moss will round out the presentation. Tomiquia is the CEO of Hamilton Families, one of San Francisco's largest family housing providers. With more than 20 years of nonprofit and public sector leadership, Tomiquia is nationally recognized as a dynamic leader with expertise in public policy and community planning. And we at Tipping Point are lucky enough to have her as a member of our leadership council. Brian, you're up first.
Thanks, Daniel. I'm going to start with a plea, a request to all of you. So they've given me a few minutes to kick us off, but really, I'm supposed to level set. That means I'm going to give you a string of data and facts and information, and it's not going to make you feel awesome. And so what I ask you to do is be patient, because I promise you on the other side of this, we will have hope, we will talk about solutions, we will have those conversations. And also, a lot of the data that I'm throwing with you, if you really like data, you're gonna find it unsatisfying. Because we're not gonna have time to drill into it, to ask questions, to figure it out. And if you really hate data, and I know some of you are there, even though you're pretending that you're not, you're not gonna find it satisfying either, because it's just kind of a lot of numbers coming at you. So you probably saw what I just did. I'm gonna set the bar really low, and then hopefully we can only go up from there. But I wanna start with asking, what is homelessness? And you might be thinking, that's kind of a dumb question, it's obvious. It means you don't have a home. But if you think about it a little bit more, so for example, the federal definition, the federal legal definition of homelessness, it means that if I'm homeless, that means that I'm living somewhere that's not fit for human habitation. Think about that for a second. Not fit for human habitation, or I'm in an emergency shelter, or I'm in transitional housing where I can't be for very long. But really, that doesn't quite get it. Like, really, what's homelessness is it means that society can't agree where I can be, right? So, like, don't sit there, don't lie there, don't sleep anywhere. Because at its core, homelessness is a catastrophic failure of our public systems and of our personal relationships with each other. So if we start there, let's look at the numbers and say, well, how are we doing? How is it? And it gets bleak quick. So California has 12% of the country's population. We have 20% of the population of individuals experiencing homelessness. That's more than Texas, Florida, Washington, Oregon, Nevada combined. And they're in California. And then if we look at kind of the most vulnerable population, so let's just think about youth. And there's a good reason to think about youth homelessness. So if you look at our homeless population, over half of them first experienced homelessness before they were 25 years old. And when you look at the homeless population that's been homeless for a long time, that means they're unlikely to self-resolve at this point. That means they need intervention. They need help. The number's the same. A little over half were first homeless under 25. So you can think about that as that's kind of our pipeline to long-term homelessness. And if we look at it from that lens, California has 30% of all of the youth experiencing homelessness in the country. New York is second, and it's not even close. We have 11,000. New York has somewhere between 2,200. If you really think, too, of the Bay Area, so if we drill it down a little bit further and look at the Bay Area has about 20% of the state. But to put that in perspective, if the Bay Area was its own state, we would have the 5th largest homeless population. If we were our own state, we would only be behind Florida, Texas, New York, the rest of California, and then it would be us. I told you it would get dire. You guys okay? You sticking with me so far? So how do we get here? That's the third question. Like, what in the world happened? Well, partially I think we can kind of think about it as chickens coming home to roost. There's been, over time, a federal disinvestment away from vulnerable populations. And that directly trickles down to local jurisdictions and what local jurisdictions can actually do in response to crisis. And so if you think about that, we can start back in the late 1970s with this deinstitutionalization of the mentally ill. So some of you are thinking that sounds like a good thing. Individuals experiencing high-level mental health needs should be able to live in the community with non-disabled peers and with appropriate supports as much as possible. Totally right. It was an amazing effort that was part of the civil rights movement, where advocates got behind it in order to drive that. But the kicker is appropriate services. And what we did from a policy perspective and from a federal government perspective is we failed to fund the commensurate level of community-based mental health services we would need to make that a reality in a good way. Then we shift gears, we go all the way up to early 1980s, where we slashed the federal government's funding for subsidized housing by 80% in today's dollars, and we never made up those cuts. So the dollars that we would, as a local jurisdiction, have to subsidize housing, to build housing, to find housing, to subsidize housing for vulnerable populations that are most in need, that money simply is not there, and we never replaced it. We cut it then. Then we engaged in this social experiment of mass incarceration. I'll give you a didn't end well. Cut right to the punchline. So basically, 1972, we only locked up less than 200,000 people. Different things happened, war on drugs, a couple of other things, boom, 2.2 million today. So the United States locks up more human beings in cages than any other country in the world. Then you go to 1996 and welfare reform. The quickest way to describe that is in 1996, if I was part of a family that needed help, 2 out of 3 of those families got help, and they got almost enough to actually make a difference. Now, it's less than 1 out of 3 that gets that help. And the grant in California, for example, and California has one of the highest grants in the state, so this is a federal issue, but the grant in California is 40% of the federal poverty level. What that means, the federal poverty level, is it means that that's less than half the amount of money I would need to survive on an emergency basis. And that's the reality of poor families right now who are on, who need help and are on those benefits. Now, there's light, a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel. I point to criminal justice reform because it's a national effort to reverse the trend of mass incarceration. Help folks get back into the community, decriminalize certain things, and allow folks to be in the community and be safe. But I do want to point out that it doesn't come without really important public policy decisions, because it's very similar to moving folks from an institution that we did in the 1970s. Like, the services are important. The amount of disruption for those individuals' lives and the society that they're coming back to, it's super important that we have good services in place so that they can be successful and thrive. And then the last one is the Affordable Care Act. a great entitlement, and California has been really a leader in figuring out how do we move forward with that and build community-based mental health services. So there's opportunity now, and there's some tools that are left despite the evisceration that began really since the 1970s. So if we can go to the next slide. That's kind of the federal picture. But what's going on the local picture that actually makes it harder? Because I know what you're thinking, right? We're really smart in San Francisco, so if it was just that, we would totally fix it. Come on, who's thinking that? Some people are thinking that. Some people are thinking that. Well, so in the Bay, it gets harder. I mean, some basic things, right? Like our housing stock is smaller. We have less rooms. We can't really build our way out of it because we run out of places to build fairly quickly. There's also a couple of other things. We are the legacy of the gold rush, right? We have massive opportunities, and right now the gold rush has turned into the Silicon rush. And as a consequence, just for example, in the last 7 years, right, we built 165,000 new jobs. That's awesome. We've only built 16,000 new homes. That's less than awesome, right? There's obvious math. I'm not awesome in math. That's a problem. There's also changing demographics because this impacts the most vulnerable populations more, right? And so you directly see it in San Francisco, for example, the African-American community. In 1990, there was 11%. Now there's less than 4%, right? There's vulnerable populations that for all kinds of reasons, institutionalized racism, lack of equity, lack of inclusion, and as a result, they immediately are the ones that are being pulled down and outside, and we see it happening in Oakland too. It's not just like San Francisco, it's spreading to Oakland, where it's 45%. African-American community was 45% in Oakland in 1990, and now it's less than 25%, right? And then lack of regional coordination and accountability. This is a regional issue. I'm from New York. I don't understand why the Bay Area is not multiple boroughs. It's not. That's not one of the policy solutions I'm going to suggest because that wouldn't work. But we have to have some sort of regional coordination and discussion and data. So we're going to get to hope now, and I'm going to pass it over to real experts. And what you're going to hear from that hope and those experts are the fact that what we really need to do is grapple with the myths, because there's lots of myths about homelessness. And it turns out that when we grapple with the myths about homelessness, what we find out is we actually know it works. We just need to do it. And we're also going to talk about how important it is to have voices of people with lived experience, not just to listen to those voices, but put them in decision roles so they can make decisions about solutions, because we really need to run this and lead this from the community up. And then we're also going to talk about the importance of partnerships, right? We need the public sector. We need the private sector. We need the community. We need everybody in this room to work together so that we can really make an impact on this crisis and be sure that especially the vulnerable among us, especially vulnerable populations, that we don't just let them fall through the cracks and aren't doing things from a policy perspective in order to be able to pull them out. And the last thing I'll say is that's also a real reason for hope. You notice how many of these things are actually the results of policy and then circumstance, right? A lot of these things are policy decisions. That means we can get out of them by making better policy decisions. And some of these are the result of the fact that there's been sudden instability because of an influx of folks from outside. And that's okay, because we can make good policies in order to engineer that. We just need everybody to say, this is my community, and we're going to be able to do that. I'm going to pass it over now to Dr. Margot Kushel.
Thanks, Brian. I'm going to try to bust a few myths. And actually, I could go on all night busting myths because there are so many myths about homelessness, but I think I'm going to stick to just 3. So myth number 1 is that shelters solve homelessness. Shelters do not solve homelessness. Shelters solve the problems like we have today, which is it's really awful to be outside right now because no one can breathe the air. So there's no question that shelters solve the immediate problem of the environment or freezing cold weather or hail or rain. But the truth of the matter is that when you're in a shelter, you're still homeless. If you have never been in a shelter, I can tell you a little bit about what most shelters are like. They're usually really big places where, at least shelters for adults, lots and lots of people sleep on mats on the floor. They often need to line up every night to get in, and pretty much every shelter kicks you out at 6 or 7 in the morning to walk around all day. I take care of many people who refuse to go to shelters because they judge themselves as safer on the streets than they are in the shelter, where people are really living crowded, emotions run high, and no one is safe. I'm from New York, and my family comes out here from New York, and they're like, what are you guys doing so wrong? Things look so much better in New York. We have a terrible homeless problem, but so does New York. But it turns out that in New York, there is a right to shelter, which means that 95% of the people experiencing homelessness are in shelters, and 5% are outside. In California, about 68% of people who experience homelessness live outside. What that means partially, though, is that homelessness looks much worse. But we could spend a lot of money trying to make the problem look less bad without actually solving the problem. And when we solve the problem, we need to center our solutions on the people who are experiencing the problems. And I hate to be provocative, and I hate to say it, but the people who are suffering are not those of us who are looking at people who are homeless. The people who are suffering are the people who are homeless. And so shelters, unfortunately, will not solve the problem of the people who are experiencing homelessness. Myth number 2 is that homelessness is caused by mental health and substance use disorders. I'm a physician, so every time I talk to electeds or anyone, they want to talk to me about the mental health and the substance use disorders that cause homelessness. Mental health and substance use disorders do not cause homelessness. The cause of homelessness is the lack of affordable housing. Full stop. That's the cause of homelessness. There's no question that people who live with mental health and substance use disorders are at a higher risk of homelessness. They are much more vulnerable in a lot of ways, and one of the ways that they're vulnerable is they're more likely to be homeless. There's also no question in my mind that homelessness causes and worsens mental health and substance use disorders. I spend a lot of time with people who are homeless, and one of the hardest conversations I hear is people talking amongst themselves about that first night that they found themselves homeless and how terrified they were. When people who are homeless, they get very little sleep, they're very likely to be assaulted, they can't take medicines, they're terrified, and they're spending every ounce of their energy trying to figure out where they're gonna sleep and where they're gonna eat. We know how to treat mental health and substance use disorders. I'm one of those people who thinks that deinstitutionalization of people with mental health disorders was a really good idea. People with disabilities deserve to live with as much independence and dignity as they can. And one of the great joys of my job is that I have the honor of taking care of people with severe mental health disabilities who are in the programs that Brian was explaining that didn't fully develop, but we have some of those in San Francisco, assertive community treatment. These are people who spent many, many years of their lives in prison-like mental health hospitals who now live in the community with great dignity. Some of them have jobs, others do volunteer work. They live with incredible courage because it's actually really hard to walk through this world when your mind works so differently than others, and yet they're living in the community and they're not homeless. So one of the reasons that I say that mental health and substance use disorders does not cause homelessness is that we can take care of people with mental health and substance use disorders without them being homeless. The other part of that myth is, though, that not everybody is homeless because they have a mental health or substance use disorder. I have a big study that's been going on since 2013 in Oakland that is looking at people who are 50 and older and experiencing homelessness. Among single adults who are homeless, about half of the population is 50 or older. In our study, we found out that about half of the people who are 50 and older and homeless had never been homeless before the age of 50. These were Tyrone, who cleaned the floors, and when he was 50 or 60, suddenly the job became too hard because he was ill. Or his mom died, and he had been living with mom. Or he lost his job, or his spouse died, and she no longer contributed to the rent. Basically, people who got to their 50s and 60s having worked their whole lives, and something went wrong, and there was no safety net. And the truth is that once these folks are homeless, a few weeks of living on the streets and being sleep deprived, I can't tell just from a distance, whether they have a mental health or substance disorder causing it or not, but they're homeless. So that's the other reason it's a myth. The last myth I want to talk about is the myth that we all have, that this is unsolvable, that we're just stuck with this problem, and then it's never going to go away. I work in medicine where there are a lot of things where we really don't know what to do, and homelessness is not one of them. We have really good evidence-based solutions for homelessness. This is not a scientific problem. This is a problem of political will. We know what to do, and all we lack is the will to do it. I'm going to take the example that people usually go to first, which are the most difficult to house, people living on the streets with severe behavioral problems who have been on the streets for long. Permanent supportive housing, which I'm really proud to say, in large part grew out of San Francisco. A few cities were at the forefront, and we were way at the forefront. Delivered in a housing-first manner, which means that you offer people subsidized housing with either on-site or closely linked voluntary services. They're not required to take them. Has been shown in study after study after study to successfully house 85% of the most difficult to house folks. So if you choose amongst the folks who are most severely impaired, living outside for the longest, every single study, another one just came out today from Denver, shows that 85% of them can be successfully housed with permanent supportive housing. The other 15%, there are actually things we know we need to do, but I think we could all agree that if we got 85% of the most difficult to house folks housed, we would feel much better than we do now. So what gives me hope is that we actually know what to do, and what really gives me hope are events like this and things like we're seeing in our political culture where people are finally talking about looking for solutions, and the fact that we finally have some Senate candidates who are talking about the need for affordable housing on the federal level, that we're passing state bonds, and that we're talking about it. We know what to do. We just need to do it, and I'm glad to see that we're finally starting to move to trying to do some of those things. I'm going to turn it over now to Amber.
Thank you so much, Margot. As mentioned earlier, my name is Amber, and I'm the Associate Director of On the Move, which is a nonprofit that provides services throughout the greater Bay Area. And at On the Move, we really are committed to making sure that we're bringing the voice of those that we serve to the forefront of important conversations. Specifically, I am lucky enough to run two initiatives, Voices and Spark, as Daniel mentioned, that put young people with real-life experience in charge of designing and leading programs that are meant to support other youth. Voices has been putting current and former foster youth in leadership positions for almost 15 years now, and has asked them to develop the strategies they use to support their peers. Over the years, Voices has supported thousands of youth in moving out of foster care and into a successful future. The Spark Project was launched in 2017 as part of Tipping Point Community's Chronic Homelessness Initiative. It's working to solve homelessness among foster youth here in San Francisco and across the Bay Area. People ask me all the time, are your programs really led by youth, or are they just youth-led? Meaning that adults make all the decisions and we push kids up to the front of the project so that they get to be the face of those projects. So when people ask me, I tell them that they should definitely direct that question to my staff, because young people will be honest with you, even if you don't really want to hear it. They'll tell you that they design the strategies that they're using to support homeless youth. They'll tell you that they set the goals and the milestones they use to measure progress. And they'll tell you that at one point in their life, they did not believe that they would ever be in a leadership position, but that one person believed in them, and that our program was able to give them a little bit of power and a little bit of authority. Now, I will not tell you that turning power over to a group of young people is easy, but I will tell you that I believe in order to be successful in addressing our homelessness crisis, we have to turn to those who have lived through it and allow them to lead the charge. I've been working in this field for more than 2 decades, and there are 3 things that I really know. Number 1 is that the move towards client-centered, trauma-informed programming is absolutely essential. For years, we've been treating homelessness like a transaction. As a service provider, I decide what works best, I offer the service to someone, and they can either accept or decline this service. But homelessness is not a transaction. Addressing homelessness with someone requires that you get into real relationship with that person, that you really know them, and that you understand where they are in their life and where they want to get to. Client-centered programming puts the person at the center of the service. It asks them what they need and what they think will work best for them, not what service providers or policymakers think what is best for them. Now, all the tools and assessments and forms that are part of our work are important. But what we have to remember is that if we set down the assessment form and really look, we're going to find an actual person there. A person that's probably experienced a great deal of trauma in their lives, a person that wants to work with a system if the system will work with them, and possibly a person that's not that scary. Which leads me to my second thing that I know, which is we as a society have got to get over our fear of being close to homeless people. Brian Stevenson, one of my favorite authors and social justice activists, talks about the importance of being proximate to people, like literally close enough so that you can reach out and put your arm around them. If we want to understand the issues of homelessness, we have to understand the people, and we need to not be afraid to pull up a chair or a park bench or a muni bench or a chunk of sidewalk and really sit down and listen and learn. Policies are predominantly created by those that are not close to people. As a result, policies are often created to solve a problem, a big, vague, nondescript problem like homelessness. But the truth is, we can't solve homelessness unless we understand the human elements that make someone homeless. And we will never get to these human elements if we're too afraid to get close to the human. The third thing that I know is that those with lived experience are less afraid of getting close to the problem. And young people with lived experience are really not afraid to get really close to the problem. I was homeless in San Francisco when I was a teenager, and I can speak with great authority and conviction about what it was like to be a homeless youth in San Francisco in the 90s. And while I may be able to understand the overarching struggles, a lot has changed since then, and my experiences are not necessarily relevant today. But my staff, made up of young people between the ages of 20 and 24, that have been homeless in the past few years and pulled themselves out of it, their experiences are relevant today. The Spark project that I mentioned earlier is a great example of effective solutions addressing homelessness. The Spark youth advocates know better than anyone what it's like to be in the foster care system, to be in the juvenile justice system, to be in the homeless system. And they also know what it feels like to be offered and to accept help. The Spark youth advocates talk to homeless young people in situations very similar to where they were not too long ago, and they do whatever it takes to help these young people find a home. Their primary data points are how are you doing and what do you need? Their main concern is that they really know that young person that they're talking to. Because once they really know that young person, then they can help design the intervention that's actually going to be successful. Once they really know those young people, then they go out and they straight hustle. I mean, they work hard. They are connecting young people to service providers. They are helping them to defend their apartment against shady landlords. They are driving them to their different appointments, whatever it takes to support those young people. Because my staff have been through it, they know what it takes to be successful. They know what it takes to check your ego at the door and accept help when someone's offering it. And they know that there will be slip-ups along the way. They know what it takes to end homelessness. And they have the passion and the drive not to be underestimated, the energy to do the hard work. In the short time that Spark has been in existence, slightly over a year now, my staff of committed, passionate, intelligent, formerly homeless young people have worked with over 400 other young people in the Bay Area. And they've actually moved dozens of kids who for years have lived on the streets of San Francisco into stable and permanent housing. They are ending youth homelessness one person at a time. Thank you. If we are going to solve the problem of homelessness, we have to stop seeing people as the problem. We've got to get close. We've got to put people needing the services at the center of their support. And we really have to empower those that have triumphed over homelessness to go out and use their extremely valuable experience to help others find their way home. Now I'm going to turn it over to Tomiquia.
Thank you, Amber. And thank you all so much for being here tonight. So I'm the closer for this portion. Everybody all right? All right. So my name is Tomiquia Moss, and I am the CEO of Hamilton Families. And I have been working in the public and social sector for more than 20 years. I know my genes are good. But I am still incredibly optimistic about the power of each and every one of us to contribute to solving society's most vexing challenges, and that is what you all represent by being here tonight. So I just want to first start off by saying thank you. I am so honored to be with this incredible panel of leaders and doers and people who are willing to take the risk to figure out what we can do together to solve this problem. Now, in the spirit of my friend Dell, who wants us to be a little bit more than just your typical panel, I'm going to encourage us to actually have a courageous conversation with each other. Who's heard that term before, courageous conversation, right? My grandmother introduced me to courageous conversation. She said, when you have something to say, you got to speak truth to power. You need to be able to articulate what it is to whomever you are talking to. So I want us to actually be in a courageous conversation tonight. And when we talk about homelessness, one of the challenges, I think, with our progressive liberal belief system here in San Francisco is that we're actually afraid to have courageous conversations about homelessness. We're afraid to talk about our implicit biases against poor people, right? That actually inform our policy decisions. It informs how we move in the world, and we don't even know it half the time, right? We don't intentionally. I mean, there are, to Amber's point, folks who are afraid and nervous about the humanitarian crisis that we have on our streets. And that is to be human. That is to be, to worry about the suffering of your fellow neighbor. But unless we understand that our implicit biases actually affect whether or not we humanize poor people, then we are never going to really solve the problem. What we're actually going to do is maintain it. And let me tell you about maintenance. I actually believe, having worked in community development, housing, homelessness for more than 2 decades, that public policy is really good at maintaining problems, right? Big systems, we got to help the people at scale. But what we aren't willing to do is figure out how to solve it, how to end it, right? Because that does mean you got to get proximate with people. Homelessness is not monolithic. After the recession, there were more than the number of families experiencing homelessness climbed, right? We had more than 2,000 students in our San Francisco Unified School District who were experiencing homelessness every night, okay? At Hamilton Families, 50% of the people that we serve are employed. They go to work every day and they're still homeless, okay? So when we talk about what are the causes of homelessness, we have to talk about the wealth inequality gap, right? Right? We have to talk about who was intentionally excluded in this country from building wealth that actually would help you weather an emergency when something goes wrong in your life, right? Who's had something go wrong in your life? What? And when it went wrong, did you not have people to help you? Okay? Why is that only bad when it's affiliated with poor people, right? Why do we add extra hustle and resilience to our most vulnerable communities in San Francisco when they need our help the most? The hurdles that a poor person, that a homeless person has to go through in order to get housed is more than I had to go through when I got my mortgage in Oakland. So how do we think about the courageous conversations that we need to talk about in order to really be about the change that's going to help us move from maintenance of homelessness to actually solving homelessness and believing that it is possible to end homelessness in our communities? We have to be courageous in that belief and be willing to understand the nuances, the complications. Guess what? It's complicated. That's also why it's hard. If we had one solution that worked for every person that's experiencing homelessness, I actually do think we could have solved it by now. But humans are dynamic. We have to be vigilant about flexible policies that allow us to have direct, sustained interventions that we know work to support the communities that we care about. Now, I want to talk a little bit about solutions because we have been really fortunate at Hamilton Families to have housed more than 500 families over this last year. We work every single day, I see some of my crew in the audience, to work with families to address their homelessness and move toward permanent stability. We're not just in the business of housing someone. Brian talked about this. When we think about homelessness, I actually don't think about just a place to live. I think about what is the process by which we break the cycle of poverty for the children and the young people that Amber serves, so that we don't have the homelessness of today being the homelessness of tomorrow. Children who are experiencing homelessness in our programs are 7 times more likely to experience homelessness as adults. So the urgency by which we must figure out solutions is now. One of the ways that we think about solutions is partnerships. We have had the incredible fortune of partnering with all kinds of people. Regular citizens, volunteers, companies, employers, people who want to figure out how can what I have be part of the solution. When we think about affordable housing in the Bay Area, 10 years ago, over the last 10 years, we produced, this gets me every time, we produced 455,000 jobs for the region over the last decade. Guess how many units of housing we produced? 55,000 units. Brian talked a little bit about this on the local level. We are not going to be able to house the folks who need housing when we are not focused on sustainable production levels at all income levels in our community. And so as we look for housing to support families experiencing homelessness, we are looking as far as Sacramento. We are looking as far as Stockton. So this is not just a local problem, this is a regional problem. And in order for us to facilitate the support that our families need to stabilize in their new communities, we have to build partnerships. We started a partnership department at Hamilton Families to really be able to help us strategically design partnerships that are going to help our families not only figure out how to get to the grocery store in Sacramento, but how are they going to be able to find livable wage jobs and youth development programs for their children? That is the power of partnerships. Everyone, our business leaders, our faith-based community, our community-based organizations, everybody actually has a role to play in having the hard conversations about what it takes to solve homelessness. And I'm really excited to be in partnership with each of you. Being a member of the Leadership Council at Tipping Point has allowed me to bring the elevation of homelessness and poverty alleviation, so that when we think about, we don't want to just solve someone's homelessness and have them wait to be homeless again. We want to have an opportunity for them to be mobile and move out of poverty. And the only way we can do that is by binding together and figuring out how we get excited about the movement that we have to create that says we can solve this problem and we're gonna solve this problem. So I'm thrilled to have this opportunity with you all today, and I think we're gonna roll into our panel discussion. Thank you.
So you're allowed to move around a little bit. I haven't sat that still for 28 minutes in a long time, but you guys were excellent. So take a breath. These questions that I'm going to ask are all of your questions. If we don't get to your questions, we are going to send something out tomorrow and answer many of the questions that you did submit prior. This first one is not one of their questions. I'm going out of order now. Margot, on solutions, we're talking about shelters, talking about being a little provocative and speaking truth to power, so I'm gonna just call you out on it right now. You know,
Get me in trouble.
we just passed a proposition that talked a lot about shelters. We talked about New York's shelter system. Should we be investing any money in shelters? Should we be investing some, a lot, a little? What's your answer? Your quick answer on that one?
Quick answer is probably a little. I think that it's going to take us some time to build housing, and I don't think we're going to only build our way out of it. I also think we need to tweak some of regulations and help families. You know, I think of homelessness as sort of building on people's strengths, and a lot of the people who experience homelessness have a lot of strengths, and they have families with strengths, and sometimes there are simpler solutions than just building housing, but we need a lot more housing, and it's going to take us time to get there. We have a population that's amongst the adults that's aging and extremely sick, and we probably need a little more shelter capacity for those who want it and need it as an interim measure. But I think it's really easy to get stuck building a lot of shelters and spending a lot of money doing it that would be better spent other ways.
So I'm staying with you, Margot. We know that a large percentage of people living on the streets are suffering from mental health and substance abuse issues, which you mentioned and talked about. If people aren't able to function well enough to navigate this complicated system that many of you referred to, what's the best way for us to help them?
You know, I think we're really quick to sort of blame the person and say that they're not navigating the system when our systems are really poorly designed to meet their needs. I think that a lot of the people, you know, substance use is a response to suffering. Substance use is a horrific disease that afflicts people of all socioeconomic status. I'm sure everybody in this room has a loved one who suffers from substance use. And it really is, in most cases, a response to trauma of some sort and suffering of some sort. And I think that for the most part, when we say people are rejecting our services, it's because we're providing them incorrectly. We do need to make services low barrier. We need to make them trauma informed. We need to make them recognize the lived experience that people have, and we need to bring them to where people are. I take care of a lot of people, and you know, and I'm so sick of reading in the newspaper of like people not accepting services, where I've got people who actually come to see me, which is already a pretty hard thing to do, where I'm like begging to get them into treatment, and I've got a fair amount of power in the system, and I can't get them into treatment. So I think that we first need to fix our own systems. I think we need to make them very low barrier. We need to bring them to where people are. You know, Dr. Barry Zevin is bringing buprenorphine treatment into the encampments and getting a lot of people on opioid replacement therapy. It's heroic and it's incredible, and we should be doing more of it. So there are probably some people who may need more than that, but I think it's a much smaller number than we talk about.
I mean, I would say, and I'm curious, Margot, if this resonates with you, but it does feel like we have a shortage of accessible mental health options
Absolutely.
For people who need them.
Absolutely.
And I think figuring out how to, you know, customize interventions appropriately, actually, and have those things on demand,
Absolutely.
could be a more useful way of figuring out how to address some of the mental health
Who's responsible for that? Is that the city? Is that UCSF?
So
is that the...
we are underbedded. I mean, the entire state of California probably doesn't have enough inpatient psychiatric beds for short-term things. That's just, I mean, youth, it's
What's
even a worse problem.
What's short-term mean?
Short-term, 2 weeks, 4 weeks to stabilize people. Yeah. You know, I'm hearing a lot of chatter now about like post-hospitalization stabilization units, and I actually think that when you actually have housing, you know, there are a lot of people who need 2 to 4 weeks to sort of get sort of their meds adjusted and get more stabilized. In places where there is actually sufficient housing, we can actually discharge those people to housing with wraparound mental health services. We talk about something a lot in medicine about engagement, that people who seem fearful or at first glance look like they're rejecting services sometimes just need a gentler approach. You sometimes need to approach them again and again. But I like to say to people, can you imagine if we had someone with leukemia who we gave them 1 day of chemotherapy and then they were like, oh, you're not better, like I'm gonna give up. Like substance use is like that. You need to approach people again and again. But I do think for mental health, we probably don't have enough inpatient beds. And then I think we create a crisis in our system because of the housing shortage, that we're sort of creating this need for intermediate mental health places that probably, if we had sufficient housing, we could do 2 to 4 weeks of inpatient and then bring them out with wraparound services. We probably don't have enough mental health services, though.
And I'd like to add, too, we definitely don't have enough mental health services. We also do not have enough culturally competent mental health services. So we have got to get some bilingual service providers into our mix. And so this is just a really important opportunity to support those young people of color in your lives, because we really need them to help down the road, because we cannot have a system designed for one type of person and expect it to work, because we have a lot more than one type of person in this
Are there
area.
good examples around the country of that? Have you seen it? Are there things that we could be doing better here locally?
I mean, there's a lot of good examples. I think that the key is to, my personal opinion, is to really keep young people in school so that they can go through the ranks and become these professionals. It's very, very challenging when you come from a low-income, monolingual family to make it all the way through college and to get a professional degree. We've got to get rid of some of those barriers so that the younger generation can rise up and be these people that we need to help the rest of us.
And it's a good point for optimism. Since you know, I had to make you depressed first, so I apologize. It's a good point for optimism. And those of you who came for discussions around Medicaid funding, because that's like your jam, this is for you. And so it's really a place where we can really look at what we've done around youth. And so also under the theme that lawyers sometimes do good things, the state was sued because there wasn't enough community-based mental health services for kids. It's a court case called KDA. The last initial is A. If you want to sleep well tonight, you can look up the complaint. It's lovely. And part of the idea was that folks shouldn't have to be institutionalized to get the level of mental health services they need when they can actually get it in the community. And if you think about it, you're talking about culturally appropriate. There's no more culturally inappropriate than saying, we'll give you what you need if we can take you and put you in something that looks a lot like a jail and feels a lot like a jail, especially to you. There's nothing more culturally inappropriate than that. And so the idea that we can build community-based services there, and the Affordable Care Act gives us a really great opportunity to do that by expanding the availability of health coverage to lots of folks who didn't have it before. And so, for example, one of the things that we could bill is the reentry population. So San Francisco, for example, so there's probably around 350 super high users that go back and forth to jail. But if you really look at them, they're not people who are doing things that, like, probably you or I would say, yes, they need to be locked up for criminal behavior. They're being locked up for incredibly low-level offenses, lots of it having to do with the fact that they're doing things that you and I would do to get ready to work for work. They just happen to do it on the street because that's where they are, right? And so there's a way to build, you could build programs around peer-to-peer case management. Because who's better to teach me how not to go back into jail and about how to, like, help me get my life together? Someone who's been through and experienced what I've experienced. And there's a way to do that where you can actually bill Medicaid, and you can bill Medicaid for newly eligible population where the feds pick up 90 cents on the dollar. So you just built a reentry peer-to-peer case management program, and you're billing the feds for 90 cents for everything that we're billing. And this has happened. Jurisdictions has done that. It's incredibly successful, and it's something that we could do here locally.
Can you give an example? How are we doing that with our initiative, the Chronic Homelessness Initiative, or are we doing that yet, Brian?
So Tipping Points Initiative?
Yeah.
You're talking about hopeful things that we can do through
Yes.
Tipping Points
Yes.
Initiative? So, I mean, I will say that before I started this work, I was an attorney, so I spent a lot of time suing the public systems. That wasn't
Very
even
good at it.
That wasn't even a joke. It's completely accurate. But since I came to Tipping Point, the opportunity to collaborate with public systems, and especially in San Francisco, I have to say has given me quite a bit of hope. And I'm not just saying that because I want to continue to partner with them, although I do. And I'm not going to sue them because I'm not going to right now. But San Francisco especially, like, so you see, like, the development of the Department of Homeless and Supportive Housing, and a real alignment around these issues, a real attention and focus to these issues, and for the first time, a real, like, a strategic plan that makes sense, that has to do with how many beds do we need, how are we going to build them, how do we get permanent supportive housing because we know that we do it, we know absolutely it works, we have a shortage, how are we going to get there? And I think that's really hopeful. But I will think, since you asked about the kind of the stuff we're doing, one of the things that really gives me hope is when we first started this work 2.5 years ago, we were told, good luck housing folks, there's no units in San Francisco. How many people think that's probably true? And you know I'm setting you up, but it's okay, just be honest. Nobody wants to raise your hand, it's okay. I thank you, sir, in the back, I can see you. Yeah, right, so, because where are the units? If we had units, why wouldn't these people be housed? Like, it only makes sense, like, there's no units. And so we did this thing where we got a nonprofit with real estate expertise to pair them with folks who were in permanent supportive housing but didn't need to be there anymore. There's just lots of people in San Francisco who are in permanent supportive housing, and they love to get out because they've actually stabilized and they're awesome and they're ready to be in a less restrictive place, but they can't, because you know how you get out of permanent supportive housing in San Francisco, generally speaking, is you die. That's the only way you can get out, because there's no place to move to. There's no rung in the ladder. And so this idea of moving to another rung and helping folks find apartments in the private market, which if you've tried to find housing in San Francisco in the private market, you know that's a little difficult, even if you're like a working professional and super sophisticated and can afford to take lots of hours out in order to go through applications and look. And so we paired them with a nonprofit that does the real estate function with these folks, and then with Section 8 vouchers. In the past 12 months or so, housed 167 people. But that's not even the hope for me, although that's awesome. The hope for me is that 80% of them housed in San Francisco, 80%. Mm-hmm. So there's actually, talking about myths.
Yeah.
There is actually units here. Now, different story if we're talking about families, totally different story. These are single adults, so we're talking about smaller places. But the fact that our city has those units, and we just to be more efficient and give some help, some culturally appropriate help in order to navigate those problems, navigate those solutions, and be able to help folks move in, we're starting to do that. And right now, actually, there's no end of the units in sight. We just need more subsidies. We need a better way to subsidize those housing so we can keep housing those folks going forward.
And the point there, which is what's so exciting about it, is that permanent supportive housing, a lot of the costs are actually in the services. So in places that have less of a housing crunch, about 30% of people move out of permanent supportive housing within a year or two to stable housing with less services. But we had been kind of stymied in San Francisco. So those 167 people who moved out meant 167 very impaired folks from the street could move off the street into permanent supportive housing successfully.
So we have a number in the city of about 7,500 units of permanent supportive housing, which is actually not bad, but that number has not grown as to keep up with
demand.
Can you give us a little bit more on that? Like, how many numbers should we be building a year back to, or one of you answering that question, and I know it's individuals versus families. How many more permanent supportive housing units do we need in the city versus regionally?
I mean, I think it partially depends on how effectively we can do what Brian just described. Mm-hmm. Probably of the 7,500 people who are on the street now, perhaps, and that's like a point in time count number, so more on the street every year, but probably half of them or so need the services of permanent supportive housing to be able to leave. The goal is to move them into permanent supportive housing, but there are going to be some people who will always need the services of permanent supportive housing, but there will be people whose lives stabilize and can move to a lower level of care, but still need the subsidy. So I think if we had another 3,500 units and then could keep recycling them, keep moving people out, that you could probably get closer to a steady state. That's just a back of the envelope. I don't know. Others have thoughts.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, since I think all of us in this room heard from many people either on the stage or in our newspapers about something called Prop C. That was a joke. Tomiquia, I'm going to let you take a first crack at this one. Will Prop C make a difference?
So I guess a couple things. The first thing for me is, San Francisco spoke very loud and clear that homelessness is one of the priority issues that they care about. 60% of you there was a 60% passage for Prop C. So what's important for me is folks are paying attention to this issue. You don't just and paying attention in a different kind of way. The experience one feels when you walk on the streets is one thing, but there are homeless folks who are not visible, or young people, or families. And so to really elevate the conversation at a local, national, international level, I think was tremendously helpful. Because what it does is it gives us a platform to engage in these types of conversations about the complexity of homelessness and how do we tackle it from each side and all sides to really get measurable outcomes. You know, when I think about the resources that Prop C will deliver, I think it is really important for everyone to recognize that those funds are not actually going to happen tomorrow. There are, you know, some legal implications that might affect how quickly those dollars will flow. But what is incredibly powerful is that the public system will have access to more resources to actually fortify its emergency response system for people who are most acutely experiencing homelessness. And that is incredibly valuable. I run one of the largest family shelters in San Francisco, and I have to privately fundraise $300,000 every year just to operate my shelter. This is emergency shelter, 60-day shelter, 6-month beds. That is a public safety net service. So when you think about adding resources that Prop C will eventually provide to that emergency response system, then I won't have to privately fundraise for my shelter. That money will be accessible for us to provide those emergency responses for families, so then I can start to use my private dollars for innovation, for thinking about how do I create ladders of opportunity and mobility strategies to move our folks from formerly homeless to permanently thriving. And so I think that there's an opportunity for us to fortify our public systems so that when we engage philanthropy, the business community, and other partners, we're able to use those dollars more creatively to really look toward new solutions.
And I apologize, I should have talked more specifically about Prop C, just assuming if you're in this room you knew about it, but it's a tax on business revenues of companies making over $50 million a year. It was a 0.5% increase on their tax base, and it's supposed to generate somewhere between $250 and $300 million a year. The idea that it didn't get to the 2/3 vote is cause for concern that it'll be litigated for a couple of years. There are many of us on this stage and in this room trying to figure out how we support the mayor and the city and county in the interim period, and whether or not there's some bridge funding to help us start to implement the will of the voters. And so we'll keep you all posted as we go through that. Amber, we've talked about this a little bit, but lots of stereotypes about young people coming to San Francisco, ending up homeless here. From what you see, why do so many people end up on our streets? You mentioned education, we gotta keep kids in school, but what are some of the other drivers?
I think the first thing that I want to say is that I have never met a young person that is choosing to be homeless. They might choose to flee a dangerous home situation. They might choose to leave an abusive group home, but I've never met a young person that's choosing to be homeless. So young people come to places where they can find community, and they can find community in San Francisco. Homeless people come to places where it doesn't rain 8 months out of the year. And young people come to places where they're going to be safe. And they form families that they then feel safe being part of. And, I think that the truth is that the same answer, applies to young people as it does to individuals or families, which is, if they don't have a choice of a place to live, then are they choosing homelessness, or are they really just out of options? And I think that we get a lot of young people here because it's a great place to live. It's not a great place to be homeless, but it's a great place to live, and there's a lot of hope. But we have to make sure that we're opening those doors so that when people come, they can go inside.
Well, you and I were talking about the myth that people come here because it's good to be homeless here. Can you talk about the kind of the discussions you've been having, especially with Prop C, with the idea that we have potentially $300 million more of funding,
Right.
that somehow that's going to draw more people? Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I think every city in this country, I travel around a lot, and every time I go to that city tells me that their city is the big draw for homeless people, and it's like Lake Wobegon. Every city is the best place to be homeless, and everyone goes there. So for adults, which is a little bit, probably a little bit different than kids, probably more similar to families, the vast, 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 mass majority of people experience homelessness where they lost their housing. Now, there is some movement from suburbs and exurbs into more dense area, but those drivers are not based on where sort of service rich. People aren't sort of saying like, ooh, San Francisco's got great services. And as an example, I can say, you know, I love Oakland. I've been running this study in Oakland for a bunch of years. Oakland's service is much less service rich than San Francisco. It doesn't have as much money as San Francisco. I've had 350 older folks in Oakland homeless, and there was part of me that was thinking, well, a lot of them are going to come to San Francisco because there's a more sort of vast health system and blah, blah, blah. I can tell you of our 350 people who started in 2013 in our study, 5 are in San Francisco, 4 of whom are living with their family members in San Francisco, and 1 who's in the shelter system. By contrast, I have 20 people in Stockton, 20 people in Fresno. People are moving east where housing is cheaper because they can solve their homelessness where you can still get a studio apartment for $600. But if people moved to get better services, I have the perfect natural experiment because it's like a $3 bus ride from Oakland to San Francisco, and there's a huge gradient of services, and people just didn't do it. And when I asked them, they said, this is my home.
Yeah, and just to sort of reinforce that point, when I served as the chief of staff to Mayor Schaaf in Oakland, we started drafting 3 years ago a housing agenda for the entire city of Oakland. And we assembled stakeholders. It was a year process. That was at the beginning of the mayor's first term. Homelessness wasn't even an agenda item on our homelessness agenda 3 years ago in Oakland. And so when you think about how rapidly housing prices are going up, incomes have remained stagnant. 67% of folks experiencing homelessness in Oakland were housed a year ago.
Yeah.
So when you think about the inflow that you talked about, Daniel, earlier, Oakland's homelessness problem is brand new for the city and for the county. And so when we think about, you know, where people want to be, folks want to be in Oakland.
That's their
They
home.
can't actually stay in Oakland because they can't afford to be in Oakland. And the shelter services, there's 1 shelter in Oakland that serves single adults and 1 family shelter in Oakland that serves families, total. So when you think about now we're in this crisis moment, there really aren't the same opportunities for folks in our cities, but they want to be home. So figuring out how to use some of the subsidies and solutions that we know work in a really targeted way in our communities across geographies, I think is part of the solution.
A lot of our folks come back from Stockton and things on Sunday for church because it's their church that they've been in their whole lives, and it's their home.
Yeah, and so we did, and one of the first things we did is we ran focus groups and went and talked to folks on the street, especially folks who experience long-term homelessness, and asked them kind of a series of questions. One of the striking things is it was more likely that they had been born in San Francisco than it was not. So just imagine, if you will, the last time you were at a cocktail party in San Francisco, where the people there were more likely to have been born in San Francisco than not. So when we're talking about building services and building homes for folks who are experiencing homelessness in Oakland and in San Francisco, we're really talking about building services and homes for San Franciscans and for, what is it, Oaklanders? What would that? I don't even know what that means.
Yes, it is.
Oaklanders, thank you.
You're welcome.
That's what we're really talking about.
Don't you live in Oakland?
New Yorker.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So this is the only self-serving question, although one of you asked this. Is Tipping Point optimistic about its goal to cut chronic homelessness in half, the goal that I mentioned before, which is of the 7,500 people, the point-in-time count last year, 2,100 of those are defined as chronically homeless, or they've been out on the street for more than a year and have a disabling condition, and usually more than one. How are we doing against this goal, Brian? Are we on track?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so on the optimism question, there's so many reasons to be optimistic. I mean, you heard a lot of them, right? I mean, we know what works. We especially know what works for long-term homelessness and folks that are chronically homeless, and it's permanent supportive housing. Like, we can do that. Also, I mean, I heard from Del, like, we can totally do that. And part of it is we have an event on homelessness during a moment when it appears that the apocalypse is happening outside. Like it's smoky and it's cold and everything, and all of you guys show up. I think there's so much movement in the public sector and public systems focusing on this, coming up with not just strategic plans, but implementing and really moving on them, that I think is a lot of reasons to feel hope and to feel optimistic. But also know, I mean, I'm a pragmatist. Like, part of me thinks that optimism is irrelevant on a lot of levels, because, I mean, basically, we have to do it. Like, we absolutely have to do it. This is the reality that we're facing. And so we have to move and have to do it, and we're looking forward to continuing to work with everybody here and the public sector, the private sector, everybody.
And I would just say, you know, as a member of the Leadership Council and sitting on the Housing Committee that sort of looks at the Chronic Homelessness Initiative, what's amazing to me is that it's focused on the right things, right? We are talking about the sort of system level impacts that we need to be thinking about in order to both address who is homeless today, how do we prevent folks from becoming homeless tomorrow, and how do we engage in the systems that are catastrophically failing on an ongoing basis to tackle the problem. And so I'm inspired by the emphasis on the right things, and I think with the partnerships that I described earlier, I think we have a shot.
I'm going to ask you each this last question, so I'll start with you, Amber. What are 3 things that we can do to help?
Vote. Turn to young people in your lives and do whatever you can to help them believe that they are capable and lovable and worthy of great things. And give hugs freely.
That's a good one. Margot?
I'm going to double down on vote, but go further and say in every conversation you have with an elected or a potential elected, for the people in this room who've got political power because you are donors or you know elected, put housing and affordable housing on the agenda at every single level of government. So that's 1. 2 is to say yes for housing. We've got a 7x7 city. We've got to build more housing, and some of that is going to be in your neighborhood, whatever neighborhood you live in. And so don't fight housing when it comes to your neighborhood. And 3 is to perhaps push back against this individual narrative. People want to be homeless, it's because of mental health or substance use, and reframe the discussion to the structural problems and the policies that got us here.
Brian?
Yeah, I mean, so yes to housing, and so, I mean, find a way to say yes to housing, whatever that means for you. If you own a building, I mean, so take subsidies, take vouchers, like figure out a ways, work with the city and use that. If you have a spare room, consider it. Consider figuring out how to use it. If there's going to be a new construction, new permanent supportive housing in your neighborhood, seek out the meetings, the community meetings that happen. Because guess who usually shows up to those community meetings? It's not people that are like, oh yeah, that might be a good idea. Right? And so we only get those housing developments built if we have people that are like, yeah, that might be a good idea. We got to show up, because otherwise the only people that are there are saying no. And so that's really, really important. So yes to housing, absolutely. I think the second one is to let's just be human, and let's remember the folks on the street. It's exactly what Del was saying. Like that's our grandparents, that's our cousins, that's our aunties, that's our uncles. That's vital, and take a minute to really think about how to engage and how to talk. And then volunteer. There's lots of organizations that are out there. If nothing else, like learn what they do so that you can support them, whether it's donating to them, whether it's budget, whether it's whatever they need. San Francisco, the Bay Area has tremendous nonprofits that are working on this problem, and we just need to support them.
Tomiquia?
Yes. I mean, amen to all those. I would say we need job opportunities for folks in our community who are experiencing homelessness. Livable wage jobs that allow folks to actually compete in the labor market and move themselves from homeless to permanent stability. We are not going to be able to solve the problem when families that we work with are working 3 jobs and still can't afford to pay the rent. So that's really important. We have to support our workers. The staff that work at my agency and all of the other nonprofits are barely surviving themselves. So we have to demand support for our workers and professional development opportunities to ensure that they build their skills and can get wages that are commiserate with their dedication and passion to the work. So I feel like there is a pathway for us to figure out how do we make sure that all of the wealth in this region is being distributed in a way that lifts up the folks not only who are experiencing homelessness, but also the people who are supporting the folks experiencing homelessness.
So I heard a few things that we can all do, that you can do in the audience. Rent your place out. Take vouchers if you're a landlord. Volunteer with great orgs like Hamilton, like Move On, like Compass, like Larkin. If you voted for Prop C, which I'm sure many, many people in this room did, great. But you also then better say yes to housing in your neighborhood, because what happened in LA after they passed a huge bond, they started talking about building housing, and neighborhood groups went up in arms saying, no, I meant to vote for housing somewhere else. So say yes to housing throughout this city and throughout this region, and in fact, throughout the state. And I will echo Margot's comment that we do have a governor-elect who has said housing is number one and homelessness is number two in priority. So that's something that should give us hope as well. Support these local groups. Shocking, you can donate to Tipping Point. We got staff at the doors that will talk to you on your way out. And I think one last thing is Brian said it, and everyone said it at one point or another, get proximate with this. Say hi to people. I said this years ago at a breakfast, at one of our breakfasts, and you walk by someone and we're just tuning people out at this point. I do it. Don't do that anymore, and don't let yourself become numb to the issue. And I think I'm preaching to the choir here. There was an amazing article in the Chronicle this morning, I believe it was this morning, and it was about a police officer, and he was talking about buying ice cream for someone on the street. And he talked about, I'm born and raised in San Francisco, and feeling a sense of what has become of our city and what has become of our region, and feeling some sort of shame and some guilt, and like that it's become where we are. But if you can't get fired up after hearing from these four and from Dell, you can't get fired up about a room of 300 plus people coming out on a Thursday night when it's really tough conditions out there for so many people. We absolutely can do this. We can be, as he said, a city that has miracles happening in it. We need to be those miracles each and every day. There are miracles happening at these groups every single day, and I want to say thank you to all of you for coming out tonight. It's a real honor to be able to do this in front of all of you. So have a good night. Be safe. Take care of your families, and stay healthy. Thank you.